Hello, everyone. My name is David McPherson. I'm a colleague of Volnick's and Shankar Sastry's group. And today, I've been invited to share with you all the valuable skill of how to read a research paper. Because before you can go out into the research field and build something that's never been done before, you first need to know what has been done before, because otherwise you might just be reinventing the wheel. Of course, the process of searching must end somewhere, and you can never be completely 100% certain of what's been done in the field before. But I hope that by the end of this talk you'll have the skills to at least be 90% certain. So today's talk will be divided into two main parts. The first half of this talk is going to be how to rapidly explore the huge space of papers to find which ones you really need to read with your limited time during the semester to do research. Second, I'll cover how to, once you've identified some key papers that are germane to your research, how to really dive deep into them, both in order to parlay with their content, use their arguments to support your arguments, and then finally how to dissect and digest a paper so that you can remix it and build on it, that you can extend it and do something truly novel. And those three steps that I've mentioned are going to come together into a three-pass system that's been promoted by Keshev in this paper. This whole talk will be based off of Keshev. It's really a quick read. I would recommend looking over it. If you get nothing else from this talk, just remember that Keshev, Keshav, wrote a paper about how to read papers, which is not as recursive as it seems, because this paper is written in ordinary English, unlike most research papers. So this one gives you the key about how to sort of break into this wildly different and fairly arcane basically genre of writing that is research writing. You see, unlike regular writing, which you're supposed to start at the beginning and then read all the way to the end, the paper is designed for you to just pick and choose bits that you want to read the abstract, sample the introduction, maybe skim some sections to find an equation that you want, and then you're done. It's wildly different than reading regular books and even reading textbooks. It is truly, truly bizarre. But before we can even talk about how to read the paper itself, we need to talk about just how to find a paper. In particular, if you were saying, well, I'm in a robotics class, I want to read some papers on robotics. Let me just pop that into Google, or rather, Google's search engine devoted solely to research papers, Google Scholar. And you pop robotics in there, and oh Nelly, 2 million results. I'm too tired for this bullshit. I can't read that many. Let's refine this a little bit. Maybe, okay, like if you're Volnick, or if you've been talking to Volnick, maybe he's convinced you that soft robotics is the way of the future. So let's search up soft robotics. 700,000 results. Ain't nobody got time for that. If you're doing robotic manipulation instead, things aren't much better. It's still on the order of hundreds of thousands of papers. You can try to refine it even further, maybe say non-holonomic control. That's the space of controls where you can't move wherever you want, basically. And you get down to the 10,000s. And then if you go hardcore, just list all the keywords. Non-holonomic control of contact-constrained soft robotics. You get down to 5,000. Even in the best case, where you know exactly what you want to work on, and you have all the keywords to filter things down, even then you still have there are too many damn papers to read. And I apologize for my use of language. But I'll say it again. There are too many damn papers to read. Instead, you need to assume the mantle of a newspaper editor, be a real newsie, and say, give me the pitch, make it worth my time, convince me that your scoop is worth it, and yeah, sort of. You're interviewing reporters to see if they've got a story worth telling. And in particular, I use this example of a newspaper editor because if a paper, you need to rapidly filter through these, and if it comes across your desk and it is taking a long time to get to the point, you need to throw it out there and say, I want pictures of Spider-Man, damn it! And so that is the sort of ruthlessness that I'm encouraging you to have here when it comes to writing papers. Now, of course, you should still harbor compassion in your heart for the poor, overworked grad students who had to write these papers, and maybe the reason why the axes aren't labeled is because they were trying to fit this in between teaching, or the undergrad who wrote this up failed to comment their code because they were squeezing this in during finals week. It's understandable why these mistakes are made, but you, as a researcher, don't have enough time in your day to put up with those mistakes either. So you need to just send them out of your life. So how do we get around this problem of there being too many papers to read? We ruthlessly filter. How can we ruthlessly filter? Well, I'll be covering that in the first of what Keshev outlines as 3 passes. The first is to filter. Well, I'll get into the details. Hang on. The second will be a longer pass. Once you've determined the paper is worth reading, you'll try to extract its content, but you won't yet critically engage with their arguments or try to disprove their proofs. You're going to save that for the third and final pass that you're really only going to do on maybe 1 out of 50, 1 out of 100 papers that you read. The third pass is reserved for basically papers that are exactly on what you're doing your research on, and you're trying to best. You're trying to advance exactly that problem. So without any further ado, let's dive into the first of these 3 passes. Filtering. So how do you be the ruthless newspaper editor? Well, first, you're just going to pull up the paper and you're going to just scan the abstract. Read that real quick. The abstract is designed for exactly this purpose in mind. It's a distilled version of the overall story. Then you're going to read the introduction. That's going to give you a pretty good idea of sort of what the problem is that they're trying to solve, who's tried to slay this dragon before, and why they fell short, and why this paper needs to come in like a knight in shining armor and get it with their special sword. After that, you're going to then ruthlessly skip all of the middle bits. And I know you hear them singing to you their siren song. Oh, look at my arguments. Oh, SPRT. What does that mean? Let me tell you about and the Newtonian simulators in the mind. But you're going to say, no. I will only look into you if you clear my threshold for the second pass. Instead of reading any of this English or any of these equations, you're just going to look at the pictures like you are a 5-year-old reading a picture book. You're going to look at the pictures and you're going to ask some basic questions like, does this make sense? Are the axes labeled? Because that can be a pretty quick way to determine whether the authors thought the paper was worth investing time in. If even the authors didn't invest the time to generate solid figures, then it's not worth your time to put in it either. And then finally, after you scan all the middle sections and throw out the extra text that you're not going to read, you just skip to the conclusion, often called the discussion in fancier papers. So you're going to read the discussion, and basically they're going to try to clarify and crystallize their arguments and their contributions and what they've done using all the facts that came in the preceding sections that you skipped. And in this section, you're just going to have to take their word for it that they did those arguments. You're mainly just trying to see if the conclusion that they reached was worthwhile. That's what this first pass is all about. Is this paper worth your while? So let's see this in action, because you're not just going to be scanning one paper. You're going to be scanning myriads of papers. I like to think about this in terms of orders of magnitude, right? So the first pass, you'll first pass maybe 10 to the 2. You're going to first pass 100 papers. Just quickly shooting through, let's say we go with Gaussian process of safe learning, a topic near and dear to my heart. And you have, 60,000 results. But don't worry, we are the eye of the tiger and the heart of a newsie. And we're going to ruthlessly cut down on these papers. And we're going to skim a bunch of these, and then hopefully we can scan them using our first pass and see which ones are worth reading. So we put in Gaussian processes here. Let's see this in action. This first top result has a ton of citations. So let's pull that out. Okay. All right. Quick side note about citations. It's not perfect. In particular, papers that just came out this year. So this one came out in 2014, and it was 2019 when I put together these slides. So it's been around for 5 years. It had time for people to look at it, decide whether it was worth commenting on, whether it could be used, if its results were strong enough to be used to build a motivation and build an argument for another paper. That's what a citation is. And so if they're old enough, they can have time to build up this number of citations. And 127 is a fairly respectable number for 5 years. That one shot up the ranks pretty fast. But for papers that just came out this year or just came out last year, they haven't had the time for people to read them, much less the time for them to do research and get their paper published. The publication cycle often takes 6 months from the time the research is finished to when the paper is released, and then that citation gets added to this count. So even in the best case, there's going to be a 6-month delay, assuming that the author can instantly read this paper as soon as it comes out, instantly finish a paper-worthy research project off of it, and then get it submitted. What's more likely is it will be like a 1.5 year delay before any citations start pouring in for this. So citations are not the end-all be-all. But they're very handy, let's say heuristic, for your A-star search amongst the space of papers. And so we're going to use this bad approximation and to sort of do the first filtering on these papers. So let's pick out the reachability-based safe learning. That looks good. Who else? Safe learning regions of attraction. Sounds cool. Let's pull that up. Safe exploration for optimization with Gaussian process. Love it. And this one here at the bottom looks pretty good too. Yeah. So we now have a lineup of a couple papers. At this point, you got papers on your desk or a bunch of tabs open on your browser, as researchers are wont to do, and you need to start reading these. But before you dive in, I would encourage you to look for trends amongst these papers, because that will help sort of give you context and also broaden the scope of what papers you're looking at. So in particular, let's look for shared names. On this page alone, this Berkeley fellow shows up 3 times. Moreover, their collaborator, Angela Schulich, shows up 2 times as well, and their advisor, Andreas Krauss, shows up both on their paper and also these 2 bottom papers that don't even have Berkeley on them. Or I guess the bottom one has Berkeley on it. So it seems like Andreas Krauss is the faculty who's really pushing this whole direction. Maybe we can go visit their website and see what they're working on now to get the inside scoop of stuff that hasn't had time to gather citations, so it might not appear on Google Scholar, but is coming from this person who's hit home runs in the past. Right, this person is, in some sense, one of the experts on the area of Gaussian processes for safe learning. So we can go to their website. Every academic is going to have a tab labeled publications, and so we're just going to hit that, pull that up. Ooh-wee! Yeah, he's still knocking out papers on this area. He has safe exploration for interactive machine learning, maybe getting away from Gaussian processes, but interested in the problem writ large. And 2019 is quite recent, especially for these slides. I put them together in 2020, so he's hot off the presses. And let's look into some of the other ones. Angela Schulich, who we mentioned, looked like she was a senior grad student. She was a bit deeper down in the list, and sure enough, she's now faculty. And so we should follow her lab. The pre-tenure faculty have a special fire in their bellies for doing new things. So definitely worth following her career if you were interested in this area of safe learning or Gaussian processes for safe learning. And so we can look at her publications. Wow, she came out with a bunch in 2020. And I put this together in January of 2020, like before the Rona. So this would have been just real rapid fire for Miss Schulich, or Dr. Schulich. And then finally, we can look at Berkeley, and alas, they've gotten scooped by DeepMind and Microsoft Research. So they are no longer with us in the world of academia. They have crossed to the other side and gone to a better place, we hope. It's sad to see them go, but we wish them well. And unfortunately, yeah, it looks like their last publication was their PhD thesis. So they might not be publishing anymore. So with that sort of background done on the characters of this drama of Gaussian processes, safe learning, we can now, we could look like we did at the publications and pull up some more papers that are related and add those to our abstract review. For now, I'm just going to drill down onto 2 of these papers, sort of as examples to you all about how to do this first pass, okay? So let's do a rapid fire first pass. Okay, reachability-based safe learning. Let's read the abstract. Ooh, reinforcement learning for robotic applications. Sounds pretty sweet. Yada, yada, yada. We have some learn constraints that are inaccurate, but we can use a principled approach to learn the system's dynamic and update them. Pretty exciting stuff. Scan that abstract as quick as you like. At that point, we can say, okay, this paper is actually about Gaussian processes and is doing the kind of learning for safety that I care about. Sometimes you'll have keywords and they'll, even if all the keywords are right, the subject actually isn't right. So for example, I do a lot of research in virtual reality, but when you search virtual reality, you'll get a bunch of really classic papers from the 90s. They're talking about virtual reality and their innovations on it. And what they're actually talking about is just 3D graphics on like a 2D screen, like every video game that exists today. Back then, they called that virtual reality. And so even if the keywords are right, you still need to check the abstract to see if the subject is actually right for you. Let's do the same thing for Berkeley over here. Control theory can provide insights, a powerful opening. One important property of nonlinear systems is the region of attraction. Okay, this is ringing a bit of a bell from, in this class we cover Lyapunov, right? So this seems like it's got a little bit of Lyapunov flavor. Very exciting, and hopefully shouldn't be too much work to understand because they're talking about something that we're already familiar with. It's one of the powers of taking these robotics classes, is that they give you sort of a linguistic toolkit or a conceptual toolkit to decode the arcana and esoteric terms in these papers. Speaking of esoteric terms, on the first pass, you should read the introduction, but you shouldn't just passively absorb, like you're putting your mouth around a garden hose that's blasting information at you. No. That's rooted in the misunderstanding that your ability to remember papers just comes from having spent time with it. And you don't actually remember time passing. You remember cognitive load. You remember things that you had to think about. And so if you want to remember this paper for any length of time, you need to be actively thinking about it while you're reading. And so I encourage you, while you're reading, to underline key concepts. If a particular idea leaps out to you, or in the case of a first pass, if they're just terms you don't understand, underline them. Think about what they could be related to in your research. Sometimes they'll share some terms. So like if you've done fluid mechanics before, you might recognize Jacobi and think, oh, this might be a calculus of variations thing. So maybe it's related to what I already know. Let me look up this term in the future. In this case, Wikipedia is actually a pretty decent source these days. And for a bunch of topics like Hamilton, Jacobi, Isaacs, that's 100 years old, the description will be quite good. This technique of Wikipediaing it doesn't work at all for new methods. So if you're trying to look up, I think long short-term memories and neural networks has been around long enough that it'll probably have a decent Wikipedia page. But just a couple of years ago, you couldn't have relied on that at all. And so you would have had to read the freshest papers from the bleeding edge of research in order to understand what that term meant. So without further ado, let's apply the same technique to the second paper. We can read down introductions, ROAs, and oh, hey, that's right. Our old friend Lyapunov is indeed here. And so that will be extremely handy. This should be something that we all already understand. They also have a second term down here about Gaussian process models. Maybe if you've taken the probability course 126, or better yet, 226A, the graduate student one, highly recommend. You'll know what Gaussian process models are. But if you haven't done those exact things, again, this is a good time to Wikipedia it. Later on, we can look at this citation that they popped there, 18, might be a good resource for looking up what Gaussian process models are as well. Okay, so now that we've read the abstract, skimmed the introduction, now, again, ignore the siren song of all these beautiful sections. We're just going to skip them. We're going to look at their figures, see if the figures make sense. We've got some kind of Gaussian process shrinking going on over here, and then some time traces about the robot's performance. Okay, this looks like this paper has some material to it, some heft, some substance worth digging into. I'd also recommend reading the section headers to see sort of what the sequence of ideas is going to be. But don't read anything besides the figures, the captions, the section headers. After that, you just skip right to the end, to the conclusion. So let's dig into that. Here on Jaime and Kenne's paper, they have, this is really lovely, here at the end. In the future, we plan to develop an algorithm that will perform real-time updates to the safe set for every discrete time point, in contrast to our current batch-based approach. In addition, we intend to look into speeding up GPU computation by incorporating sparse GPs. The reason why I got so excited about this is because they are doing what I think is the best virtue for researchers, which is that they are front and center, or I guess in this case, back and center. The conclusion is still a fairly high place of honor in writing. They're putting it for everyone to see that their algorithm is not perfect, and they exactly outline what the current flaws are. And if someone, a particularly industrious undergrad, wanted to extend it, they've listed exactly what the quests would be. And so this is hugely valuable, and this sort of already earns them a spot in my heart, and I'll probably do a second pass on this paper just because they've done that. Let's read the second paper. They talk about Lyapunov regions abstractions. And here they do something similar. While they say, while some of the assumptions in section 2 may be restrictive for practical applications, very modest, they say, the results of this paper should be understood as a theoretical foundation for learning algorithms that learn without risking instability. And so they acknowledge that they have some fairly strict assumptions, but they are able to identify sort of the usefulness of this theory, which is that it should form sort of a substratum for some practical applications. Very good. And so before we move on to, now that we've decided that we want to read these papers, we'll do a second pass on them. Before we do a second pass, it's worth sort of doing a recursive search, because basically these little references sections are like a curated version of a Google Scholar search. They'll also have a bunch of titles you might want to consider. They don't list the citation numbers, but the fact that they're being cited here suggests that they're already part of the thought process of the top thinkers. So I would highly encourage you to look through the references, identify key names here. It looks like J.H. Galula and C.J. Tomlin turn up quite a bit. Again, here's another Krauss paper, self-citation, classic. Here's that resource about Gaussian processes that we promised. We'll look into that. Maybe pull that up on a tab. This is very exciting. Our second paper also cited Jaime and Kenne. So we're starting to see that our Jaime and Kenne paper really is sort of at the nexus of a lot of thought on this subject. And so pat ourselves on the back for finding a good paper there. It's always nice to see a familiar face. And so sort of to conclude this first phase of doing a rapid scan, after a rapid scan of one paper, you should be able to decide if the paper is worth your time. And in particular, you should be able to extract in a very short period of time, just like 5 to 10 minutes, what I'm going to call the 5 C's, yar. And that's going to be the category of the paper, whether this is an experimental paper or a theory paper, a design paper, or a measurement paper. You want to know sort of what its deal is. Then you want to find out the context, which is what papers came before, why didn't they work, what tools are they going to use, basically. If all researchers are standing on the shoulders of giants, then which giants are these particular researchers standing on? Finally, or middly, on the third C, you should be able to gauge correctness. Note here, I'm not talking about correctness of their proofs. That's going to require much deeper review. No, the correctness I'm talking about here is just about the barest assumptions, the very first things that they're assuming. So from the introduction, you could read that they're going to try to use Gaussian processes for statistics. And from there, you know immediately they're assuming a Bayesian approach. They're assuming that the world is random. They're assuming that they'll have large amounts of data. Is it fair to assume that you have large amounts of data when you are learning online on a safety critical situation? Maybe not. These are the questions that you should be asking about what basic assumptions they're making and whether those are valid. The fourth C is the contributions. You should be able to tell what this paper's done, what they think that they've done at the very least, whether or not they've actually are correct in their conclusions is something for a later pass. You just want to know what their claims are. And then finally, clarity. This one is not even about the science, it's just about how it's presented. But frankly, if a paper is not, if you're not able to determine these 5 things from just reading the abstract and the introduction, then this author has not devoted the time to make the paper easy to understand, and you shouldn't be devoting your time to it either. Because your time is so limited, there's so many papers out there to read. There is not enough time in the day. Life is too short to waste on badly written papers. It would take, maybe there's something in there, but you would have to spend so much time to break the marrow out of those hard, petrified bones. Just cut that out of your life. You don't need that toxic energy. So, category, context, correctness, contributions, and clarity. With that first pass, you should have narrowed down from literally like tens to 100 papers and narrowed that down to just a handful, maybe a dozen papers that you want to read further. This will bring you to how to dissect a paper. And particularly, this will center around questioning their assumptions. And so now with the filtering pass behind us, we now dive into the second and third passes. So let me just dive right into the second pass. Remember. And the second pass is interested in the problem of, but basically the outcome, if the outcome of the first pass is being able to filter out papers, the outcome of the second pass is being able to remember the content of a paper enough that you can use it in conversation in the future. Your goal here is to understand the argument, understand what methods they used, and understand the usage of their contributions, so that let's say you're in a conversation with a lab mate or with a fellow research partner in this class project, and they're saying like, what could we use for safe learning? Maybe there's some sort of statistical method. You can be like, oh yes, Gaussian processes have been used, and actually I know Berkenkamp and Krauss and Schulig have done a lot on this subject. Maybe we check them out. And that will help you sort of shortcut having to do a search from scratch, because you'll know what's relevant. And so in order to accomplish that sort of familiarity with papers, I'm going to break it down to basically these 3 steps, which is that you can now read those middle sections. Give into the siren song, dive into the text, but don't read all the text. You've already read the abstract and introduction. Now you're going to read all of the English portions, and you're going to skip the proofs. I know. Proofs are beautiful, and that's sort of where the mathematical meat is. But you can't just read a proof passively. The point of a proof is to sort of show beyond a shadow of a doubt that something is true, that there's a mathematical truth here. And in order to really appreciate that, you need to, at every step of the proof, be asking, why are they assuming that? Is that regularity condition too much? Or is there a corner case that would break this for all statement? You need to be asking, like, why this particular class of model? Could they have chosen a different class? These are the kind of sort of nitty-gritty critical reasoning questions you should bring to a mathematical proof. And without spending 5 to 6 hours, is the number that Koushil gives. I think for our field, it's going to be more like 1 or 2 days to really question a proof, to interrogate it. You're not going to be doing it justice. So just for the second pass, in order to keep things tight, down to maybe more like an hour or 2 hours, we're going to skip the proofs. So you're reading all the English text, right? You're clipping along, reading the English text, enjoying all this section about testing the SPRT model, and then you're going to read the text here, text here, text here. That's fine, but you're going to skip these equations here and try to avoid getting too in the weeds. And instead, you're going to try to understand their argument, understand where they're coming from, and what evidence they have, and if that evidence is enough. And in particular, like I mentioned, in order to remember, you need to be cognitively engaged. And so I would encourage you to be asking questions of their figures. You should ask, are they labeling their axes? Again, if they're not labeling their axes, they're not putting the time into this, neither should you. Are the figures and captions self-explanatory? How would I have presented this figure, or what kind of point would I have made here? And seeing that difference will be quite illuminating. My main pro tip for this second pass is that you jot down key points or comments in the margins. I mean, in particular, while you're reading, you'll sometimes wonder, like, oh, I wonder how this other paper is related. Write that down so you can look into that later. Or you could say, I wonder whether this would be like peanut butter and chocolate to combine these two things. And while you're reading, you're not just receiving their information, you're also sort of sparking and erupting and bringing out information in your own brain that's related. And that sort of mix of your knowledge and the paper's knowledge is going to create new knowledge. And those sparks will eventually become the seed for new research ideas. This is where new research ideas come from. So make sure to not let those sparks just die out and fall to the ground. You need to capture them by writing them in the margin. Plus, that'll keep you cognitively engaged and you'll remember it longer. So that's just worthwhile. So with this second pass done, you're now at the point where you can use these arguments in a conversation and be able to talk about what's been done before. From reading these papers, you'll find that a couple of these are almost exactly what you want to do. These will be sort of what I call your one true love, or sometimes your three true loves, in that you're going to have a handful, always less than 5 per project, of papers that you're basically going to want to reproduce exactly. And that's the spirit of the third pass. The third pass is all about virtually re-implementing their work. And what I mean by that is that you're going to be reading their paper, and before you continue on, so let's say you're getting to the proofs, right? And you're clipping through their proof, and you get to a point where they're going to introduce something. Before you read the next sentence, just ask, what would I put here? And sort of draw out the way that you would have done the proof. If you get stuck, look at their proof and see how they got unstuck. And that will introduce a new mathematical technique that you wouldn't have thought of. That's why you got stuck. And that will be very instructive to you. But oftentimes, you'll also bump into places where they use a technique that you think is, wait, that's illegal. That technique is incorrect to use here. That's not, like, that requires certain assumptions. And you'll discover that they've made, maybe possibly unconsciously, they've made tacit assumptions. They have these hidden assumptions that they didn't mention, possibly because they just took it for granted. Maybe there's something more insidious going on. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt and just say that they forgot to mention this assumption. But the fact that you've uncovered this hidden assumption often is going to be the gateway for new research that will blow that assumption apart and really extend their idea beyond the sort of limited domain that they had before. And that's how you extend and do something truly novel rather than just reuse old ideas. And so, like I mentioned, you're going to make assumptions explicit by asking yourself how you would have presented the idea or how you would have derived that algorithm. You'll ask why they assumed what they did and sort of discover the hidden assumptions and ask whether they're actually valid, and see what happens when you change the domain of the application. And so then the assumptions will change. Does their theorem still work? If it doesn't still work, maybe there's a little bit of work there for you to do to extend it to that domain. And that's, again, where new research comes from. So my pro tip for this section will be to jot down these sparks of realizations of what assumptions are needed and what assumptions will break and that you need to substitute with something new. And so in this third section, make sure to not, again, don't let those sparks fall to the ground and go out. You need to capture them in the margins. And have the pro tip of keeping you cognitively engaged so you'll actually remember it. It's hugely important that you stay active. All right, so in these 3 passes, 1, 2, and 3, we've shot through them here and it seems pretty straightforward. Maybe you're eager to try this for yourself. I'll just warn you that this can be pretty timely. So the first pass is designed to only take 5 to 10 minutes. And again, if a paper can't communicate their main subject to you in 5 to 10 minutes, then it's highly probable that they don't understand it very well themselves. Or they just didn't have the time to put together a good exposition. Either way, it won't be worth your reading. Your life is not long enough to read bad papers, so filter that one out. In the second pass, you're going to actually read the content of the paper, but skip all the sections that would require sort of critical interrogation. So particularly you're going to skip proofs. That second pass is sort of grasp their argument before you start critiquing it. That grasping pass is going to take basically around 1 hour. Keshav says that it takes him an hour. Volnik and I talked about it. This often takes quite a bit more longer than an hour, maybe more like 3 hours. So don't beat yourself up too much about it. Keshav has been a professor for years, whereas you all are just starting. And then finally, Keshav says that he can get the third pass down to an hour, which is wild. I think that's just his area. He does communications. I think he published this paper at SIGCOM. Yes, SIGCOM, Computer Communication Review. And so maybe it varies by area. I have never known someone to be able to critically analyze a paper in an hour. Maybe Shankar could do it, but for us, I'm going to say it's more like 4 to 5 hours. And for brand new students, if this is your first time doing it, don't be surprised if it ends up taking maybe 20 to 30 hours, if it takes multiple days. That's okay, because you're going to be not just doing a third pass on the ideas, but also oftentimes for this class, because you're re-implementing algorithms and using code bases, you're going to also be re-implementing their engineering work. And that's all part and parcel. So that's okay if it inflates that number by a lot. And so that sort of brings us to the end of the talk. We've talked about how to do a literature review, how to skim papers to rapidly filter them out, then how to also use, to basically do this recursive tree search down literature reviews, starting with the Google Scholar, identifying key players in the field, and also using references, the sort of references section of papers that you've read to then spawn further papers for you to read. And then you can use their references section. And then when you read those, you can use their reference section. It goes on and on. So this tree could grow to be infinity, which is why it's important that you cut out papers that are not worth your time. And then after you've identified a couple of papers that are worthwhile, that are germane to your research, we've talked about how you can dissect them. In the core, if I could just have one thing you take away from this talk, is that you need to stay cognitively engaged by writing in the margins, shouting at the paper and saying, "Why are you doing it this way?" Or "Why would you make that assumption?" And be critical, be interrogative, be sort of in a discourse with the paper. This is part of the talk where I would solicit questions. Unfortunately, this is just a video, but feel free to email me at davidmcpherson@berkeley.edu, or if you're watching this during like a lab section, you can just turn and talk to your TA at this point. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a wonderful day.